I'm Miranda Prynne, Content Curator for THE Campus, where we share peer-to-peer advice and insight in teaching and learning and other key areas of higher education, from academics and university staff all over the world. As we emerge from the respond to recover phase of the pandemic, a lot of the focus has turned to what elements of the digital transformation are here to stay, and how technology can best support universities in providing quality, flexible teaching and learning that serves ever more diverse student bodies. So to help answer some of these questions, I'm going to hand over to Rob, who will share some insight on where the digital transformation of higher education may be headed. As Tim's mentioned, if you have any questions or comments, please do share them in the chat and we will do our best to get to them in the time available. Rob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Miranda, and thank you, Tim, as well. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I am coming to you from the very wet banks of Rutgers University in central New Jersey this morning. We got our version of the Ida hurricane coming up the Northeast coast. I hope everybody is safe. I want to first acknowledge for everyone that it's been a super difficult time. So often we hear the students who've been appropriately, the empathy has been directed toward them. Is their remote experience, remote learning challenges related to equity. But for those of us working, for those of us communicating, science says remote's actually really hard. We study a lot of brainwave activity from our usability labs, and the gamma and the beta, which is stress, are higher during remote meetings. We don't get the human feedback, the human, just the human connection that we're so accustomed to. And these meetings do generate more stress. And because we don't commute, we don't have that personal transition time, we're finding out that through chat logs, through activity logs, we see a dramatic increase. This is an increase across the time clock. Regardless of the time of day, people are working more, but that's no more true than on the edges of the day. So I think it's important that we sort of say all of us are under a great deal of stress, faculty, staff, and obviously students. I've taken, I think the power of place has never been more in question. It was always a critical part of our identity, an institution's campus, its location, defined it as urban, rural, brought vibrancy to a community, and indeed was the community and often the very value prop. And so now we're asked, what does place mean and how do we create that community and that experience that we promise both faculty and students? And student-centeredness is really at the heart. And I wanted to just define a couple of things when I say student-centered shift or shibboleth. To cut to the chase on our presentation, the answer is both. There is an ongoing shift that's certainly occurring. But for those that may not know the sort of biblical story of a shibboleth, there was one group that couldn't pronounce sh. So as a way of differentiating whether or not they were allowed into the walls and over a bridge, they were asked to say the word shibboleth to get over the bridge, which meant stream. But the Ephraimites, could only say shibboleth. And so we've seen examples of these, and this phrase and this parable essentially has evolved to mean anything that we might say that builds community. We see this in all walks of life. Those who follow the same football club or those who love a particular team or from a particular style often drop a word to let the other know we're on the same team. And so shibboleth around student-centeredness often means, we have the same mindset. We are thinking about shifting toward more student-centered engagement. But then we don't actually know what student-centered means. So if you go to the learning definition from edglossary.org, they actually have a caution statement that says, when using the word student-centered, as people from vendors often do, to mean something that says, whatever you might want it to mean so I can sell you something, I actually want to define it in two distinct ways. First, there's an institutional definition. The institutional definition says that we as an institution are going to do more to make sure that we are student-centered, which goes beyond just learning. And in many cases, student-centered is analogous to personalized learning, as it says here. But I think it's the total engagement model. And I'm going to refer to some examples where people are becoming student-centered by looking at the holistic experience and indeed that power of place to understand, how do we get you to campus physically or digitally? What is that experience that you're going to have? And are we actually thinking through with empathy for your viewpoint? Or are we actually thinking through for operational efficiency from our viewpoint? And so definition one of student-centered is that institutional view, and it's a holistic engagement around the personas of a diverse student population that you're serving. The second, which I think is worth a deep conversation, but one that we often don't have the chance to discuss, is an ecosystem view of student-centered. The realities of today is that we have to store records, engagement, and accountability is held at the institutional level. But to be student-centered in the lifelong learning model and to support the pathways that we need to support from K to career and reskilling and career advancement, we need an entirely different ecosystem. One that healthcare has a fairly good model that we could emulate, but I don't think we need to just copy it. And so the concept of who manages the data, if it's not an individual institution, who is the governing entity of the data for a student-centered ecosystem, actually requires a collaborative consortium and a shibboleth, if you will, to be formed amongst the participating institutions. So in some cases, it's a Ministry of Education. In other cases, it may be a regional workforce board. It may be a self-organized collaboration of institutions. But one early example of student-centered deployment that I'm seeing is actually coming out of the state of Maryland through a project called the Bounce Back Project, where youth and individuals who you could say have earned their way into the juvenile justice system are certainly not defined by those few early behaviors in their youth. And Bounce Back is not a punitive model, but rather a reform-based model to allow those individuals to move from the juvenile justice system and into career mobility and even advanced degrees. So it's being managed across all institutions, and what's following them is funding, because they're doing the research that shows it's actually cheaper to get you educated than it is to keep you incarcerated. And that's not only cheaper, it pays back more to the state of Maryland. So, that concept of what we've learned in 2020 and having that framing, these were all things that were underway. No one didn't think of this before the pandemic. The pandemic clearly happened, right? And so there's no question that remote learning was turned on very quickly. I'm going to borrow a phrase from Brian Alexander, who publishes a futurist blog on higher education. He calls it a toggle term. And a toggle term meaning just as quickly as we toggle on our phones, we went to remote learning. A heroic move by most IT professionals, and an adopting of business models that were equally turned off. How we do business, how we engage. I would argue that the greatest benefit, and there are always benefits in a crisis. I took enough business school courses to learn that, that from this type of a crisis, we have blown away the walls of resistance that we, on many academic institutions, we proudly maintained. Our tradition, our history kept the "we've always done it this way" model somewhat alive. And the fact that we had a wait list, the fact that there were students still clamoring to come to our institution didn't really drive any urgency for change. So the pandemic, if anything, was a massive accelerant for change, but it has caused a great deal of question around how do we look at ourselves and our identity and the very value that we promised both faculty and students, which is this place, this campus that's full of stimulating people that press you on ideas and cause you to discover more, produce more, was now in conflict with the remote learning experience. In some cases, we even saw students and parents effectively demand a refund because the website said, coming to our campus is our product. We are not delivering on that campus experience. So are we delivering on our product? The answer ultimately was yes. It became sort of an option for whether institutions did provide refunds, but I've not been aware globally of any legal action that actually produced the failure to deliver by an institution. But that delivery model has now called into question this evolution, which we've often heard of: respond, recover, reimagine. And if I were to get super tactical on the classroom experience, remote learning was our emergency response. Akin to a digital tent city for learning, we quickly said, how do we maintain health? How do we maintain connectivity? How do we protect people? How do we keep the classes going? And remote learning was our quick answer. I don't believe anyone has sat down and pedagogically said, remote learning is what we want. Very different than online learning, which was a purposefully produced pedagogy that had a lot of self-paced activity. But hybrid is now emerging as students come back to campus. They are eager to come back to campus where that's feasible for them. But the reality is they're not always demanding to go back to class. And we have shown students around the world that we can accommodate them and we can include them without being in class. So as they return to campus, whether they are on an internship, they're on a co-op job, they have a family obligation, or in some cases in the US, they're athletes traveling. They want to know that they can join a class remotely, even if they're still on campus. And so that hybrid model that's emerging, in most cases, the key question here is who's in control. The institution in hybrid is basically telling you, whether it's K through 12 or college, these are the days that you can come to campus, or this is the window of months that we're going to have first and second years on campus. We'll allow third and fourth years or juniors and seniors to return to campus in the spring. And we've seen that hybrid approach, but high flex. Some have called it multimodal. Professor Beatty out of the University of California, San Francisco coined the term high flex about 5 years ago. And it's this concept that high flex actually shifts control to the student. And I think that's an example of student centeredness when you start to think through, well, what does that look like? And how do we redesign our lecture spaces? We redesign our teacher pods. In some cases, we want to keep faculty safe. But high flex is this model that allows the physical place, the gathering, the classroom to still be a core part of the experience. But the individual is now choosing the modality in which they're going to engage on that day. And there's really no dramatic drop in access to the information. Another core element, I'm picking an example. They're not the only institution to do this, but many of you may have heard of the term design thinking. Design thinking is out of IDEO Labs, actually tied to Stanford, notably the Stanford Business School, Graduate School of Business, as they would call it. So, but that has become an innovation, again, that higher ed launched, but whose practices are actually replete within retail. And so the story, which is very real at Houston Community College, was they went to the local American baseball team, the Houston Astros. They did a tour of the park, and they noticed that the Astros were managing all of the fan experiences through the lens of personas. The midweek business entertainer, the family, the date night, the group that gets together, girls' night out at the ballpark. And so they went through and realized that they were serving very different folks who all wanted the experience of the ball game, but they wanted something different. And Houston decided that that level of persona, that design thinking mentality that starts with empathy, but requires research. It requires you to understand who you're serving. We serve diverse learners. I don't think anyone would ever argue that our learner population isn't diverse. So therefore, if you can better understand them and you can tailor your offering, you can change what you do so that efficiency is actually given up in replace of effectiveness. And this is a large change management mindset. So we go to high flex, we think about students first. Well, there's 10 different personas, the 10th at Houston being the unnamed persona, recognizing that we didn't get them all. The change is difficult. And I think I want to go back a century and give a great, sort of, this is a picture from the archives. This is Manhattan, that's known as the Flatiron Building, right in the middle. And you can see that the dominant technology of the day was the horse. Science had allowed us to domesticate the horse, put it to for hundreds of years, we've put it to work for us. And even in urban areas, it was pulling warehousing carts, transportation, moving people around. But 20 years later, that's just 20 years. And I'm going to pull this up a little bit later, but I'll ask you, when did you select your ERP system? So if we want to put 20 years in perspective, when did you choose your SIS system is about the same amount of time that these pictures were taken, and the horse was completely replaced by the automobile. I think higher education does not look to the Teamsters Union for inspiration enough. In fact, this may be the first time you've looked to the Teamsters for inspiration. And for those who may not know, the Teamsters is the US union, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. That is the truckers, the warehousemen, and their goal in life and what they do is they move things for commerce. They move goods and services. Their name, their title, and their logo is based on them moving horses around and managing horses. Their method was horses, but their value was transportation and logistics. They understood that their value was not defined by their method. And I think that's actually an important point of inspiration for higher education, because our methods have been so tried and true for years. Our traditions are what we wrap ourselves around. But when we look from a design thinking standpoint, value is perceived differently from our consumers and how we serve. Obviously, that wasn't the only example. We could look at music, we can look at newspapers, we can look at the evolution of television to subscription. These are all consumer-based. But if you were in the record distribution business, you were in the record or CD business, you went out of business. But if you were in the music business, you've changed your method, but it has proliferated. Music has not died. So the core question when we think about our place is, how do we add value? To whom do we add value? And what are the differentiated things that they covet? For many of us, our lecture, as proud as we are of it, and I'm a living, breathing example of it right now, our lecture, while an effective method, is not the only method. And it's not truly what people value us for. They may value us for the community, the connections, the interaction, the inspiration. So understanding that teaching is our method, but learning is what people value. What's the economy that values? Federal funding is what values us. Regional funding, employer contribution. They want to know that the value you provide is accreditation, it's assessment, it's the assertion that this person is ready for the workforce because they have your degree, not just because they can do calculus or they published one paper, but they think critically, they engage, they listen, they have the right communication style. And so what people value us for is very often, it's not how or what we teach, it's the students that we produce that go out and change things. They change the world, they change companies. And so when we think about place and experiences, I'll go back to that music analogy and hope that we understand value. Because I would argue that 85%, and I made that number up, it's an argument, of the hands that you see up there, which I will admit is a creepy picture in pandemic times. We are 18 months at least away from and to experiences like that, in my opinion. But 85% of the hands in that picture were reluctant to pay 99 cents to own that person's song. That person with their hands up high, who's being revered by the audience, I would argue 85% of those students refused to pay 99 cents to own that song. I'll let you posit what they paid for a ticket that close to stage. That lasted 3 hours. I'm going to say in US dollars or pounds, it was probably 250 pounds that they paid, but somewhere in the 200 pounds range is what they paid for that spot, that experience, to listen to a song for 2 hours. And so when we start to think about what people covet, they will covet coming together. They will covet experiences. And when we think about experiences and the role of IT, what's Microsoft's role? The best data we have, but I think it's relatively consistent globally, is I'm aware that in Australia, the Gulf, South Africa, Europe, the ecosystem for ERP and SIS solutions is still unfortunately dominated by US vendors who have solutions. Yes, there are regional heroes. Tribal being a good example, and I don't mean to name anyone and forget others, but Ellucian's banner product, whether it was Oracle or /PeopleSoft, SAP, these were systems that were selected, and I asked you this question earlier, at the earliest 97, 98, typically at the latest 2004, but the overwhelming majority were implemented and selected 20 years ago. That means we're dealing and running on technology. As of today, according to Tambali, and I believe the US is probably a little ahead of some of the other areas, only 4.5% have actually selected. This isn't live, only selected. If we conservatively estimate that less than half, or if we just put the number at half, that means that 98% are still running a system that was designed 20 years ago. So as we start to think about experience and that concert and being student-centered, we have to ground ourselves. I'll go back to the Teamsters. It's still 1905 from our core infrastructure. For those in IT, we have done a lot to proliferate. Departmental innovation has done a lot to make up for the fact that we really haven't entered that third big wave. And I've grossly oversimplified. But when we look at major investments in infrastructure, the goal of the mainframe was purely digitization, to take information in file cabinets and put it into a large database. And we had a wonderful green screen at which we could enter data, which for those, and I know some are in the audience, actually stuck punch cards into computers. The green screen was a leap forward, and green bar reports gave us the ability to sit down, and smiles are out there, we've all seen them. We could actually look at data and spin it in different ways. And big software empowered the end user. Big software was about automation, graphical user interfaces. It came with great reporting and workflow and web self-service. And so now students could get out of line and get online. But I want to point out that I was here during that time. The single greatest question when selecting big software was always, how will you support our unique characteristics? Number one question was always, we're not like other schools. How flexible is your system to support what we do? What everyone asked. The inherent assumption there, and I don't mean to be crude, was we ain't changing. We ain't doing anything differently. Your software needs to change. And so as we now move forward, where the cloud is bringing the opportunity for intelligence, super high degrees of personalization, shared insight from shared data, there really is no longer a UI. The concept is that your nudges, your pushes should fall into the UIs I already have. I already have an iPhone. I already have another tool. You should pop me an alert. You should just send me an email. You should show up in the LMS. You should pop in your portal and just guide me to what to do. And so this concept we talked about earlier of multimodal was never designed to be part of the original software experience. So we've created this proliferation of systems to try to bridge those gaps. And I think that's where the goal here, and where as a technologist, we would say, we can help, but the goal is people. We actually need to think through who are the people we serve, who are those that serve them, and actually look at that double jointed persona. Because there are faculty, there are staff, there are advisors. We need to get inside their head every day, have empathy for their job. So in turn, they can have better insight and better empathy for the people that they serve. And this is, to be rather trite, it's a change management strategy. And I think we've heard for the past 10 years, this let's buy technology so we have a digital strategy that was still really tied to, we're still gonna do our stuff. CIO, could you please do something exciting and digital so we can put it on our website to say that we were smart? And at the University of Tulsa recently recognized their CIO. They gave Paige a wonderful letter of commendation and recognized her as a wonderful CIO because she pushed the agenda, as all of us are. We need an education strategy today. This is not about applying technology to what we're comfortable and always doing, but rather this is about what is our new model for engagement? Who are we serving? How are we serving them? And what does that look like? And that requires, and I acknowledge this is a major cultural shift for institutions for whom faculty deserve to be revered. Faculty are some of the best published and well-read innovators on earth. Merely being around them is a wonderful benefit of coming to your place, being at a place where faculty member XYZ or publisher of this book, but getting the campus community to understand, and here's where I think the pandemic can really help us, is that culture and embracing that growth mindset for what does student-centeredness actually mean? It doesn't mean lowering standards. It doesn't mean accommodating people who are soft, but it does mean understanding that our learner population is very different. We can share research, as we showed with HCC, on those personas. We can clearly define who they are and get buy-in that, yes, a reskilled employed, an employed learner looking for reskilling that has a white collar job, that whose employer will pay our executive education, or in some cases, we're seeing liberal arts being taught to businesses to build empathy, to build understanding, to build better insight into psychology. You're now looking at the engagement model for an employed worker or someone who needs reskilling is very different than the engagement model for a first-time full-time freshman. So as we think about building culture, Microsoft is a huge user of Carol Dweck's growth mindset. And so we're moving from that big software to cloud to understand that process optimization is still important, but we can do that through the lens of people optimization. I know that's very trite, but the heart of student-centeredness is that, well, who are we serving? How are we serving? And can we design the experiences with empathy for what they're trying to face? Simply having courses Monday through Friday between 8 and 4 may not work. It may not be very, very empathetic for a number of learner styles. So how can we use technology to preserve those values, that preserve who we are and how we do it, but also allow us to stick to our value of delivering learning and connected experiences? And so that's where, when I wrap up, I'm going to go back to that Houston clip. I was at Faculty Convocation just a week ago, and I've taken this with permission. Chancellor Maldonado, and honestly, I look to a number of our workforce and technical colleges who are driving change and are the first leaders in the beach in empathetic, student-centered engagement. I just love this quote. I'm not going to read it back to you. You all can see. Well, I guess if we have those who are looking for audio or visual assistance, personalized learning is the intersection of diversity and technology. Couldn't have said it better myself. I think we all embrace diversity, and using technology to deliver more empathetic, student-centered experiences is something I think we can all get behind. So this is a practice change. This is not a product. This is not something that you're just going to go buy and get. It requires incredible buy-in from both the business and IT, and a disciplined, understood model that I happen to be a tennis player, and I went and bought all of Roger Federer's clothes and racket. And I don't play anything like him. So the product doesn't matter, it's your practice. Buying Roger Federer's racket does not make me a better player, but practice and evolving my skills does. So I just want to thank you, open it up for questions, and I appreciate the half hour that I was given, Miranda. Cheers.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. I'm afraid we're out of time. So if anyone's got any questions, we will endeavour to get them across to Rob. His contact details were there at the end of the slide, or do send them to me or any of our events team, and we'll try and get back to you that way. Rob, thank you so much. Loads of fascinating insight there, and we hope to speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you all.